I'm Anthony Newcastle. I'm in Adelaide as part of the Masters in Narrative Therapy at the Dulwich Centre. And I'm originally from the Northern Territory. I'm an Aboriginal man from the Northern Territory. I live in Brisbane at the moment, and so much of the work that I'm doing as part of the Masters in Narrative Therapy is in Brisbane. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about that today. So today there are three parts of my discussion. So, and it's predominantly around didgeridoo. So the first part is about didgeridoo. It is how it came about and what we do at didgeridoo, so to introduce what didgeridoo is. The second part is about the No More campaign, which the men of didgeridoo participated in. In fact, they graciously allowed me to be quite influential and lead them into this campaign. A campaign to raise awareness and support for men who have been sexually abused in childhood. The third part of my discussion is about what had been made possible as a result of didgeridoo and as a result of the No More campaign. So, to some degree, the No More campaign and what has been made possible in didgeridoo is also about the influence of narrative therapy and my engagement in the Master's degree at the Dulwich Centre through the University of Melbourne and what I've been doing in my work. So, didgeridoo lessons and didgeridoo. Over the past 12 months, I've facilitated a group of Aboriginal men who gather together to learn to play the didgeridoo, an Aboriginal musical instrument. The primary purpose of this gathering for the men who attend is simply to play the didgeridoo. For me, there was a secondary purpose, and this to provide opportunity for positive engagement for Aboriginal men and young men. A place of solidarity around culture and identity, particularly in a big city like Brisbane. During this past 12 months, we've been meeting each second Sunday at a local park in Brisbane for about 2 hours. There are between 12 and 16 men and young men who are regularly attending the didgeridoo group. Yeah, so at this point, I feel it's important to say that no one is court-ordered to attend. There are no judicial, employment or other organisational or institutional requirements for anyone to attend. They attend freely. So to give voice to the timeline, as the didgeridoo group were meeting regularly and as when I was getting ready to join the first teaching block at the Masters of Narrative Therapy in Adelaide, I took up some of the readings which are provided as part of the course. Now, maps of narrative therapy and externalising and remembering conversations, they all grabbed my attention. But something which also got me thinking was this idea of giving the problem a name. Because when you give it a name, you can engage with it differently. It's externalised and to some degree, it has its own identity and character. So you're able to now engage with it in a particular way, in a way of your choosing. So now, our didgeridoo lessons weren't at all a problem, but this idea in narrative therapy about giving something a name grabbed my attention. I wanted our didgeridoo group also to have a name, for it to represent something among the men and their families, for them to richly describe what it is for them and what it meant for them. It to have its own identity and for it to be described by those who attend and by those who come across it in a way that we choose. I was very interested in this. So as a result, and after some discussion, I named our didgeridoo group Didgeri. I then created a logo, and whenever I text the men of didgeridoo, individually or collectively, the logo is attached to the text. All of a sudden, among the men and boys, came this solidarity, this unity or camaraderie. It felt as though we really were now part of something together. We had given a name to something we wanted to engage with. This said, didgeridoo is not part of any idea to incorporate. It's not funded. It's It's just a group of people who meet to learn to play the didgeridoo. It's a group of people who meet to come together around a common interest. So since giving the group a name, Didgeri, something else changed. The want or desire on the part of those who attend is that they now want to learn or exchange more about culture and identity. They want to have more of these discussions about being Aboriginal and about living in a big city, often far from our ancestral and custodial homes. So for all of the men and young men who attend, they and I are what's left over after past and continued policies of assimilation and degradation and separation. Past and present policies which at its purpose were to separate generations of Aboriginal people from their culture and their home. And this was the same for the men of Didgeri, and many have experienced this across their entire lives. So this idea of culture and identity led to the exploration of creating ceremony. So I came across this idea of definitional ceremony and described by Meyhoff. So definitional ceremonies deal with the problems of invisibility and marginality. They are strategies that provide opportunities for being seen and in one's own terms, garnering witness to one's worth, vitality and being. So this really resonated with me, and I raised the idea of our Didgeri group creating our own ceremony, a process and practice we would follow each time we came together as Didgeri. But to take this idea of ceremony into the realm of definitional ceremony, encourage one of our group, after each time we met, to talk about what we did whenever we came together. So we had two kinds of ceremonies. So our group was open to this idea, and although we continued to try to implement these ideas of ceremony and definitional ceremony, the practice of ceremony continues at this time to be the more successful than the definitional one. And that's more particularly because when you have a group of people gathering together and they're trying something out, and then somebody reports back to everybody what that was like and what they picked up in that, then it's a very useful thing to do, but it can also be a very fun and engaging thing for people to experience as well. So the practice of ceremony for Didgeri now follows a particular path. So when everyone arrives, greetings and discussions take place. We then gather in a circle with didgeridoos for acknowledgement of country, of elders, of each other from the places we and our ancestors come. A dreaming story is told or retold. Now, I tell one or two Aboriginal stories of the didgeridoo each week in order that everyone remembers this story and can probably speak about this in their own lives and contexts. So they're now taking these stories and culture and identity with them when they go throughout their next fortnight. So didgeridoo lessons then begin. A recap of last lessons before then practicing a new part of our lesson. We break then for food. And during this break is opportunity to raise issues and talk about those kind of things that are important to us. So more lately, I've been introducing ideas of narrative and narrative therapy and how this might influence and take part in our lives. And then back to didgeridoo lessons, practice, then homework before we all depart and go our separate ways. So that's a little bit of the story about where Didgeri comes from. So now the No More campaign. At this time, a friend of mine, Gordon, an Aboriginal man, who was working with the Royal Commission into Institutional Abuse, and who was also a member of Didgeri, brought two Aboriginal men along to Didgeri, who had been recently given evidence as victims of their own sexual abuse as children to the Royal Commission. These two men also became part of our Didgeri family. Some weeks later, Gordon introduced me to Gary Foster, who was working for Anglicare and who was interested in getting a couple of Aboriginal voices to his No More campaign. As we three, Gordon, myself and Gary, talked, discussions turned to something that had never been done or attempted before. the possibility for a collective group of Aboriginal people, predominantly men, to speak via video to Aboriginal men who had experienced sexual abuse in childhood, who were now living with this experience in their life and the lives of their family. So given predominant historical Australian male attitudes of sexuality, gender, homophobia, I knew this undertaking was going to be pretty big, and was probably going to challenge some of the fellas in Didgeri, and probably going to challenge me in many ways as well. So I had to find a way to be brave about taking this on, knowing that there was this backdrop to this kind of idea of male sexual abuse. I was also aware that more broadly across the community, the protection and support of children and women with regard to sex crime was hard fought, and now able to be discussed or supported in many ways. This issue, however, male rape, was and continued to remain one of those social taboos. Male as victim of childhood rape, who were now men in their 40s, 50s and 60s, much less engagement around and seemingly less support for them across the community. One of the early discussions I had with the men of Didgeri was born out of something I had read, written by Michael White. No one is a passive recipient of trauma. This is true in relation to individuals, and it is also true in relation to groups and communities. A trauma had been committed on our brothers and on our community. I took this Michael White quote, actually, to the men, and I read it at our Didgeri gathering. Unexpectedly, some of the men didn't know where to place this. I should have guessed that. One said, "Brother, I don't really know what to say." And so there were some of those discussions, but there was a kind of air of, well, okay, what do you want to do? So my early discussions with the men on Didgeri was around these men who now, as fathers, sons, brothers, husbands, uncles, grandfathers and elders in our community, who were resisting the effect of trauma which had been imposed upon them as boys. So I was placing this not only with those people, but also with our community. It was amongst us. So not only would we be sending messages of support to the men, that we would be in some small way sending messages of love and support to the families of these men. We would be saying, we see you. We acknowledge you and your pain. We in some small way want to say, we stand with you. Short discussions about some of what we might know these men had gone through. Some people gave examples of what they knew had happened. One man who had been associated with Didgeri, who had lived through child sexual abuse in institutions over many years, had suppressed what had happened to him for decades. Now in his late 40s, these memories and associated feelings visit him often, and the impact that these place on his family was concerning to us. So much so that we knew of this story where his wife and his children, who were in their late teens, daughter and son, would wake up in the middle of the night and they would have to go and look for Dad. So there were times when they couldn't find him. One occasion in particular where they went out into the streets at near 1 a.m. to find him. After walking or driving slowly around the streets, the daughter suggested to Mum and the brother that they take a look down at the rail crossing. Sure enough, they found Dad. He was standing on the railway tracks, waiting for the next train to come and end his pain. As we slowly made our way through these discussions, I had to find ways to keep the understanding relevant and current for the men, as we met at Didgeri. I was also mindful not to be too or overly enthusiastic or result-driven around this idea of creating these collective voices around this topic. After all, remember, these men had only come to learn to play the didgeridoo. So I wanted the men in the community to be involved to the level that felt comfortable, and let people know that if you don't feel comfortable, it's okay not to be involved. And there are a number of people who said, look, I don't feel comfortable with this topic. So to help me think about how to do this, I was reminded early in the Masters, now I have trouble pronouncing the name, Temeletu Kiwi Nemesis. She asked 2 questions in the preface of a publication: conversations about gender, culture, violence, and narrative practice. Now, these 2 questions: has the professionalism of our work crossed off the possibilities for grassroots community action to address violence against women? So I liked that statement. The other question, and if so, how can we turn this around? How can our work support local community initiatives? So Didgeri and the No More campaign was this local initiative that we might be able to work in and among. So as an Aboriginal man from a continually colonised culture, one who has grown up hearing the sound of domestic violence ringing in my ears in the neighbours' houses where I lived, up and down my street, I've posed some thought which in many ways support Temelutu's question. So new ideas are great, new practices are fantastic, but if you bring them and impose these upon us as though you and they are so right that you leave no space for us to integrate these into our lived experience, then you'll find resistance rather than support. So after weeks of planning, discussions, and talking about what we might contribute to others in our community who have experienced hard times, the men of Didgeri and others I approached to participate in the No More campaign gathered together at a local community radio station just down the road from where we hosted Didgeri to contribute their voices of support and their images to the men and families whose lives have been so dramatically impacted by child sexual abuse. So this leads us now to my 3rd part of the discussion. What has been possible as a result of this? So we created this video. We gathered in a room. We had our statements that we wanted to make to support these people that we wanted to support, to let them know they weren't alone in our thoughts and in our heart. So something profound has happened. The men and young men of Didgeri now engage differently. These men are concreters, maintenance workers, labourers. Many wear steel-capped boots and high-vis shirts. They are what might be called your average blokes. What has been made possible is opportunity for these men to now engage with each other differently. I've noticed this over the period since we engaged around the No More campaign. It has also allowed me to explore the idea of using narrative therapy, conversations in a way that invite these men to have these terms relevant in their lives. So some of these now men use terms when speaking with their families around remembering conversations about the effect this has in their lives, about remembering a mother who has now passed away, but how she influenced my life in terms of my values and my beliefs. Others describe externalising, how the problem is the problem and the person is not the problem, and how this can change their perspective in discussions with friends and family and workmates. Not in really big and profound ways, but in ways nonetheless. What has become possible is an idea which I am now growing, where I am finding ways to introduce narrative ideas and ways to help guide your conversations among groups, community and individuals, almost as counselling for non-counsellors. How can you use these ideas and methods as non-counsellors to help you have discussions with others in your life who are in need of someone to talk to? So this is the way now that I have begun to work, to share this idea that I'm engaged in around narrative therapy, and this is what the Masters has helped me to do. So to end, what has also been made possible is another No More video, which has been planned for release over the next few months. As I travel and work among groups and groups of men, I've invited collective letters from men in faraway places to the men of Didgeri. I bring those back to the men of Didgeri, and during our Didgeri lessons we pause for something to eat. I read the letters, and then the men of Didgeri write back. So narrative practice has also allowed this opportunity for groups of men to share their knowledge and experience with each other and to talk to each other across the country. But I'm excited to see how we go around this idea of counselling for non-counsellors, using narrative practice and terminology and ideas for people to help each other in their community.